you've ever learned about content form identity. For new criticism, content identity outweighs form identity and vice versa. Post-new criticism, however, is provisionally contextualized into what object, to how mode. Let us pick up native speaker following
Four. Without getting too far into the ontology of poetry, one thing seems clear, that poems cannot be treated just as strings of sentences or phrases waiting to be assigned meanings. They are not merely texts. Identifying poetry rests on more than just linguistic or textual facts. Because of the innumerable poetic forms, sonnets, lyrics, epics, free verse, iambic pentameters, and so forth, it is misleading to speak of a language of poetry as such. What all poems share, as poems, cannot be specified through formal linguistic properties alone. Poetry is identified not linguistically, but through other kinds of conventions, notably conventions relating participants, poets and readers alike, in a practice. These conventions cover expectations, modes of response, assumptions about values and interests. One familiar convention has been called the principle of functionality, broadly the idea that what is there in the poem is there for a purpose. Things are not just accidentally, as they are. Point 28. This need not be read unduly intentionalistically, but is a basic assumption of reading poetry, an assumption that is the first pointer to the indivisibility of form and content. Reading poetry demands a sharper attention to detail than is characteristic of other kinds of reading. Not surprisingly, as the form of expression, the actual choice of words, is assigned unusual salience, that follows from the principle of functionality. It is common to think of poetic language, in its many manifestations, as language that somehow. 28. C. Steinhorgum Olsen, The Structure of Literary Understanding, Cambridge University Press, 1978, pp. 94-5. 38. Peter Lamar Q. draws attention to itself, is concentrated or dense or expressive. There need not be any necessary syntactic or semantic conditions that make this possible, but conventional usages, metaphor, imagery, rhythm, rhyme, versification, etc., might facilitate it. All this is commonplace. Incidentally, the conventions for reading poetry and those for reading novels are not identical, although they have much in common. A kind of form-content fusion applies to fictional characterization. What a fictional character is intimately connected to the modes of its presentation. Point 29, but salient form in novels relates conventionally more to structural features than fine-grained facts about, say, word order or alliteration. The shift of focus from intrinsic linguistic properties of texts to reading practices in characterizing the unity of form and content in poetry has important repercussions for the elusiveness of poetic meaning. Those inclined to think that form-content unity is discoverable in certain kinds of texts, but not others, will most likely have in mind poetry that seems especially resistant to literal paraphrase, i.e. difficult poetry. Everyone could produce their own favorite examples of difficult poetry, and clearly there is not just one way of being difficult. These lines, fairly randomly picked, seem to resist easy paraphrase, but for different reasons. Not but they die, the teasers and the dreams, not but they die, and tell the careful flood to give them what they clamor for and why. First stanza of The Teasers by William Empson. When by now and tree by leaf she laughed his joy, she cried his grief, bird by snow, and stir by still anyone's any was all to her. Fourth stanza of Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town by E. Cummings. In such lines there does seem to be an intimate connection between what is said and how it is said, and the compression of 29. See my on the distance between literary narratives and real-life narratives, in Dan Hutto, ed., Narrative and Understanding Persons. Royal Institute of Philosophy Supplement, Cambridge. Cambridge University Press, 2007, pp 117-132. The Elusiveness of Poetic Meaning 39. Both no doubt contributes to the difficulty. But the case for form-content unity does not rest on examples of this kind. Indeed, when both Bradley and Clenth Brooks seek to exemplify their thesis, they reach for quite different kinds of cases. Brooks picks the final lines of Wordsworth's ode, Intimations of Immortality, from Recollections of Early Childhood. To me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. He rightly points out that taken in isolation from the rest of the poem these lines seem either grossly sentimental or patent nonsense. But if we are interested, as we should be, in the complex of attitudes achieved by the poem as a whole, we must attend to its effective and essential structure, a structure that cannot be abstracted from its comprehensive realization in the work. 30. Decontextualizing lines dilutes, even destroys, their content. Bradley picks the most quoted line of all and one with, it seems, no trace of difficulty to be or not to be, that is the question. He comments, "You may say that this means the same, as what is just now occupying my attention is the comparative disadvantages of continuing to live, or putting an end to myself. And for practical purposes the purpose, for example, of a coronet it does. But as the second version altogether misrepresents the speaker, at that moment of his existence, while the first does represent him, how can they for any but a practical, or logical purpose, be said to have the same sense?" 31. Bradley doesn't deny the practical usefulness of the Kivir-style paraphrase, but merely insists that a fine-grained response to the line, doing justice to the dramatic context and speaker, cannot be satisfied with any expression but the line itself. Further points about meaning are near at hand. In normal, non-poetic, linguistic contexts, simple substitution principles apply, exceptions apart. Substitute synonym for synonym and meaning is preserved. Substitute name for co-referring name and 30. Brooks, Heresy of Paraphrase, p. 169. 31. Bradley, Poetry, p. 20. 40. Peter Lamar Q. Truth is preserved. Substitution does sometimes break down, in familiar kinds of cases, non-extensional contexts in the case of truth, perhaps quotational contexts in the case of sense. 32. Bradley offers his own example from poetry. People say, for instance, steed and horse have the same meaning, and in bad poetry they have, but not in poetry that is poetry. Bring forth the horse. The horse was brought, in truth he was a noble steed. Says Byron in Mazeppa. If the two words mean the same here, transpose them, bring forth the steed. The steed was brought, in truth he was a noble horse. And ask again, if they mean the same. 33. Bradley clearly implies that they do not. But in the context of the earlier discussion the issue is not straightforward. If interest relativity is right, then there is no absolute answer to Bradley's question, no fact of the matter. Perhaps we should ask not simply whether the substituted lines mean the same, for which different answers might be given, but can we as readers of the poem be indifferent to the substitution? The principle of functionality suggests not. Meaning in poetry is fine-grained and context-sensitive to a degree that is not exhibited or demanded elsewhere. That is why such substitutions fail. It would be wrong, though, once again, to think of this as something we discover in looking at poems, rather than something we demand of poetry. Context sensitivity and fine-grainedness are conditions readers impose on appropriate response to poetry as poetry. This is true also of other putative features of poetic language, including what Monroe Beardsley called semantic density and Clenth Brooks called irony, a kind of internal tension. These, like form content. 32 Ernie Lepore has shown how synonym substitution fails in quotation. 1. Bachelor is the first word in bachelors are unmarried men. 2. Unmarried man is the first word in bachelors are unmarried men. He calls quotation a hyperintentional context and suggests that, like quoted expressions, poems too create hyperintentional contexts. Ernie Lepore, The Heresy of Paraphrase, When the Medium Really is the Message, paper given to Oslo Conference on Metaphor, Poetry, Paraphrase, November, 2007, 33 Bradley, Poetry, p. 20. The Elusiveness of Poetic Meaning. 41. Unity are not objective features of certain kinds of texts, but imputed features arising from certain kinds of attention to texts. It is not an attention normally given, for example, to philosophical texts, where one of Kivi's rough and ready paraphrases, sufficient to preserve truth and argument, might be an adequate substitute. Even Kivi admits that his paraphrases of poetry will not be, cannot be, perfect. The crucial question is not how good a paraphrase is but what interests it serves. Where does this leave content and meaning? It has come to seem that if you want a theory of poetic meaning, what is needed is not a theory of meaning as such but a theory of poetry. It is the peculiarity of poetry and the conventional modes of response to it that lie behind form-content unity, more than some mysterious ineffability of meaning. Bradley has shown that the content of a poem, properly so-called, is not just its subject but its subject, realized in a particular form. What a poem is about, its content, is given under a description, it is maximally fine-grained. That is not to say that it cannot be loosely paraphrased, for, arguably, Bradley's point is not a point about meaning, but a point about modes of attention and ultimately value. A good reader attends not to some content beyond or behind the mode of presentation, but to the mode of presentation itself, to the fact that what is being said in this way. A theory of poetic meaning is elusive, because no theory of meaning seems able to accommodate this kind of fine-grainedness. V.